As I see the campaign in '68, the issue of Vietnam itself is a vital one, of course, and you could pass a harsh judgment on that war if it were isolated altogether from any domestic consequences or any other international consequences. But underneath all of this, I think, is a fundamental judgment that we're called upon to make as to what the real role of America is, to what direction do we want to give to America. And I see this is the fundamental test that we have to face up to in the electoral process of the year 1968.
If the communist intention was to take and seize the cities, they came closer here at Hue than anywhere else. And now, 3 weeks after the offensive began, the firing still goes on from here on the new side of the city and across the Perfume River to the old side, the Citadel.
Someone said whenever you get into a war, the first thing that loses out is progressive society. You just can't debate it, you can't think about it, you can't afford it. You get divided in hostile rhetoric.
Campaigns were a little different in those years. The '68 campaign actually started in '68, not in 1967 or 1966. The major event, of course, was the New Hampshire primary, first in the nation and very important.
Johnson, 316. McCarthy quite strong with over 50% of the vote.
Eugene McCarthy had rolled up 42% against Lyndon Johnson, the President of the United States. People forget, though, Johnson's name was not on the ballot. I don't know what the Democrats were doing. Johnson ran as a write-in in New Hampshire against a filed candidate. And that's one reason that McCarthy got to 42% to Johnson's 49%. But the wound for Johnson was enormous, and the press built it up and built it up. 4 days later, Bobby Kennedy suddenly stepped into the race and challenged Gene McCarthy for the Democratic nomination and Lyndon Johnson.
The remarkable New Hampshire campaign of Senator Eugene McCarthy has proven how deep are the present divisions within our party and within our country.
That was really the last straw. Kennedy hated Johnson, Johnson hated Kennedy. Johnson knew from that moment onward it was going to be misery, pure misery every day.
Most of the country was either against the war or was not in favor of the war. Nobody wanted to really fight this war. And the way the war seemed to be a disaster, continuing disaster, that he obviously, in the polls, he couldn't get elected.
Accordingly, I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
He wanted to go out as a hero rather than as a goat. And the way to do that was to say, I'm making a great sacrifice of another term as your president. And I'd win it, you know. But I've decided that peace in Vietnam should be my single ambition during the remaining months of my term, and that will be my job each and every day. So he really had his heart set on the Paris peace talks, beginning and potentially getting at least a tentative solution outlined before he left office.
Johnson chose not to run in 1968 principally because of health reasons. He had had a near fatal heart attack in 1955 at the age of 47. And he was aware of the fact that his grandfather and his father both died of heart ailments in their early 60s. Essentially, his heart was a ticking time bomb. And he didn't want to put the American people through the crisis of having their president either die or be ill during the course of his reign as president. I think he was also aware that the country was being driven apart by his policy in Vietnam, and it might be better for him to step aside.
If Johnson was out, that meant Hubert Humphrey was in, and I thought Humphrey was the strongest candidate the Democrats could run in 1968.
It was like almost being blindsided. Dad had to make a decision, and he had to make it fairly soon. And so it happened within a month. I mean, if you go from thinking you're going to be perhaps on the ticket again as vice president and working closely with a president that's going to run for re-election and is going to get elected, to all of a sudden, whoops, I'm in the middle of this and now I'm a presidential candidate.
Humphrey was one of the most productive senators in all of American history. He was a courageous guy. He was willing to stand up for civil rights when it was enormously unpopular, even in many northern states, much less the South.
Every American, black or white, rich or poor, has the right in this land of ours to a safe and a decent neighborhood, and on this there can be no compromise.
He was a real optimist in politics, and he called it the politics of joy. And if ever there was a phrase that didn't fit 1968, it was that.
Here we are the way politics ought to be in America. The politics of happiness, the politics of purpose, and the politics of joy. And that's the way it's going to be all the way from here on out.
He believed in the Johnson domestic policies. His conundrum was Vietnam. Since almost the beginning of the Johnson administration, Humphrey had been on the outs with Johnson because Humphrey had severe doubts about Johnson's policies in Vietnam. The real Hubert Humphrey never was on display during the Johnson administration. When Humphrey's name would come up from time to time, Johnson would dismiss him with this phrase, "Don't worry about Hubert, I've got his pecker in my pocket." And truly, that's the way he treated Hubert Humphrey. But there was simply no doubt that Humphrey was going to be the nominee as long as Lyndon Johnson didn't pull it away from him or try to take the nomination himself.
At Chicago last July, Vice President Richard M. Nixon was viewed almost unanimously as the Republican Party's natural successor to Dwight D. Eisenhower.
He had lost to John F. Kennedy in a race Republicans thought he should have won. He'd gone to California, been defeated for governor by Pat Brown. He then held his so-called last press conference.
But as I leave you, I want you to know, just think how much you're going to be missing. You don't have Nixon to kick around anymore.
He'd quit politics, practiced law, and then went out and campaigned for Goldwater in the worst defeat the Republican Party had suffered since 1936.
Nixon, in the 1966 midterm elections, campaigned tirelessly for virtually every Republican on the ballot anywhere, and Republicans did very well. So Nixon had built up a lot of chits, and he was able to cash them in, and he was the front runner from the word go. But naturally, given Nixon's record of loss, other Republicans weren't simply going to yield.
The main characters were George Romney, Rockefeller, who announced he wasn't going to run and then announced he was going to run, and the silent candidate Reagan.
In recent weeks, you said you didn't think we should have been involved at all, and that President Johnson's decision to expand the bombing wasn't going to resolve the problem. Isn't your position a bit inconsistent with what it was, and what do you propose we do now?
Well, you know, when I came back from Vietnam, I just had the greatest brainwashing that anybody can get.
By the generals?
When you go over to Vietnam, well, not only by the generals, but also by the diplomatic corps over there.
He had been brainwashed by the generals there, which probably actually occurred, but his critics said that it only took a light rinse, and that was the end of his candidacy.
The charge against Nixon was he couldn't win. George Romney withdrew before the first primary in New Hampshire. Rockefeller didn't amount to much, so he was really running against himself. One of the things that now is almost an accepted fact is that Nixon had a, quote, secret plan to end the Vietnam War, that he had uttered these words. He never said them. The story, as I understand it, is that Rockefeller
told a reporter that Nixon's running around saying he has a secret plan, and the reporter reported it in Nixon's mouth. And for years, Nixon sought to dispel that, said he never said it. He finally gave up.
Nixon sees what all Americans see in 1968, which is that the nation is being torn apart. And he realizes that there's this great silent majority, he calls it, of middle Americans who are going to work every day, who are trying to put food on their table, they're working hard for their families, and they're not protesting on the streets. And if he appeals to them, that majority of Americans, he can win the election. And that's exactly what he does.
We've got some difficult days ahead, but it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop. And I don't mind. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land.
I have some very sad news for all of you, and I think sad news for all of our fellow citizens and people who love peace all over the world. And that is that Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis.
We were trying to get some traction on poor working poor people. So it seemed logical to go to Memphis. It was an example of workers trying to get collective bargaining. It was during the Memphis trip, of course, Dr. King was assassinated. They redefined a lot for America. About 2 weeks before he was killed, there was a Harris poll. Dr. King was about 52% in the negative among blacks. They thought he had left the civil rights movement to deal with the war in Vietnam. They thought that was out of our zone of interest. About 70% of whites were anti-Martin Luther King. He died a very unpopular, very hated man.
And when he was assassinated, it was sort of like, wow, is it over, or what do you do, or how can we go on? And there were a lot of black people who were, of course, angry, and those were people, mainly young ones, who started the rioting that occurred in cities all over the country as a reaction. So there was anger, there was confusion, there was bitterness, and for some people, sort of happy that, you know, the guy's out of the way, which one can't imagine, but there were people who uttered things like that.
And all of this was in the context in the Democratic Party of a party that was in office and that had responsibility and was being held accountable. In the midst of a heated presidential election campaign with a war going on, with body bags coming home, we have an assassination. And the campaign has to stop. And all of them stop for 2 weeks. How do you deal with that? And at the same time, the campaign has to go on.
I had always been ambivalent about Bobby Kennedy. I sort of considered him like the good Bobby and the bad Bobby. The bad Bobby was before JFK was assassinated, who really didn't think the civil rights movement was going anywhere. Not that he was hostile to it, he thought it was a blip on the screen and didn't want to pay that much attention to it. But after JFK was assassinated, Bobby became quite an activist with a social conscience.
What I think is quite clear is that we can work together in the last analysis, and that what has been going on within the United States over the period of the last 3 years, the divisions, the violence, the disenchantment with our society, the divisions, whether it's between blacks and whites, between the poor and the more affluent, or between age groups, or on the war in Vietnam, that we can start to work together. We are a great country and a selfish country and a compassionate country. And I intend to make that my basis for running and over the period of the next few months.
I saw a lot of potential in him, and it wasn't because he was a Kennedy. Although being a Kennedy, I thought that if he got elected, he might be able to, use the Kennedy, whatever that is they've got, to do something. So I had sort of high hopes for him.
My thanks to all of you, and now it's on to Chicago, and let's win there. Thank you very much.
Well, I think Dad saw him as a serious threat. He knew there was a wellspring of love and likeness for the Kennedy family. And Robert Kennedy was able to tap into that, and he certainly on his own. He had that great capacity.
If there's a doctor in the house, I want to see him right here. Everybody else, please stay back.
That's when I began thinking, if you're a leader, then you can be struck down just for articulating things. But coming so close after Martin's assassination, it was just totally dispiriting.
George McGovern briefly jumped into the presidential race after Robert Kennedy's murder in order to give the Kennedy delegates an option, but he didn't stay in long. He needed to run for re-election to the Senate from South Dakota.
George Wallace basically took a position of being a third-party candidate that took many of those southern states, almost all of them, out of the picture.
His image in Alabama was his image nationally.
I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
And I think the decision to run as an independent in '68 rather than as a Democrat was the sense that it would be difficult to win the nomination. He knew that, and after the primaries were over, he would be out of the picture. But as a third-party candidate, he would be in the limelight, if you will, and have a public forum until November, articulating frustrations many people had with both national parties, Republican and Democratic Party.
Because there's not one dime's worth of difference in the attitude of the National Democratic Party and the National Republican Party. He certainly could have put the presidency of the United States into the House of Representatives. There was a real possibility he could do that. He also was making himself a tremendous national figure and a national force.
We must have a national leadership which does not apologize, condone, and explain away lawlessness. The typical American of all races is tired of riots, of crime running rampant in every city of our nation.
I just thought he was race baiting, and I knew he didn't have any chance of victory given the history of American politics, and that whatever happened, Wallace wasn't going to be the president. And so I didn't really think, except for him inflaming, public opinion in some quarters, that he was worth me spending my time, thinking about.
As the Republican delegates gathered in this resort city, it soon became clear that Nixon was also their choice by an overwhelming mandate.
By the time of the Miami Convention, Governor Romney had waned. Governor Rockefeller, who obviously had an endless supply of funding, had waned but didn't admit it. And the real threat to Richard Nixon's nomination during that week at Miami Beach came from the brand new Republican governor of California, Ronald Reagan.
And he was by then the acknowledged new leader of the conservative movement. And if Reagan got into the race, he could pull off the conservative Republicans from the coalition we were putting together of Nixon center Republicans and the Goldwater conservatives. He could pull them off and deny us enough votes to have an open convention, in which case it could stampede to Reagan. I think Nixon got Reagan's acquiescence that he could go first in the Republican primaries, and Reagan would not get in and would give him a free hand and let Nixon see if he could come through and win New Hampshire convincingly and win Wisconsin. And if Nixon did, then Reagan would not get in. But if Nixon failed by then, Reagan could come in. I think that was the deal they cut.
We're going to win because at a time that America cries out for the unity that this administration has destroyed, the Republican Party, after a spirited contest for its nomination for president and vice president, stands united before the nation tonight.
The Republicans had a sunny convention full of happiness and pleasantries. There was no bitter division that was obvious from the floor or from the TV screens. It wasn't an exceptional convention, but it was a tightly scripted convention, and it went according to plan, and Nixon emerged looking better. He was the new Nixon. The Democratic Convention was a much different story. Chicago had become virtually an armed camp, filled with thousands and thousands and thousands of angry young people who were determined to stop Hubert Humphrey and, by inference, Lyndon Johnson.
We'll be nominating Hubert Humphrey, but anything we can do to discourage them will be, I'm sure, wholeheartedly appreciated by most of the nation.
It was riot central as much as it was the Democratic National Convention.
I was out in Chicago planning the Nixon rally, which was to come into Chicago after the Democratic National Convention. I mean, it was mob mentality. The streets were filled with demonstrators and cops, and mayhem was breaking out. And those of us who were there for Nixon just looked at it in bewilderment.
I was up on the 19th floor at the Hilton Hotel, and Nixon would call me from Key Biscayne. So he called me one night and woke me up almost. It must have been 1 or 2 in the morning. He said, "What's going on?" And so I, "Sir, you want to know what's going on?" I opened the window and held the phone by the window. I was on the 19th floor. And all you could hear was screams below, "F you Daley, F you Daley, dump the hump, dump the hump, dump the hump." The anti-war demonstrators wanted to be rid of Humphrey. They thought he was totally compromised, that he had been outspoken in supporting Johnson's war, which they detested, and they wanted him dumped as the candidate. He was the focus of hostility by the Gene McCarthy and McGovern forces by then at the Democratic Convention.
Humphrey was dying inside. He wanted to tell people what he really believed about Vietnam. Even before the convention, Johnson sent very direct messages to Humphrey. If you break with my war policy, I will make sure that that convention is unpleasant for you.
Johnson was intensely interested in what was happening there. I think he was most interested in ensuring that his plank on Vietnam remained in the party platform.
Humphrey's going to favor stopping the bombing. That's what he's going to put in the platform. And when he does, I think he'll get probably a majority. I'd hope he wouldn't. I just hope that they'd defeat, but he'll get the Kennedys and McGoverns and Humphrey, and I guess all three of them together with nobody there representing us except John. And none of them speaking up on it. God knows what happened.
Fundamentally, Johnson loved power. And he had already had several months being the retiring president, and he didn't like it one bit. He realized that Humphrey really hadn't sold. Johnson knew the party leaders in the various states, he knew the chairman of the caucuses, and the convention had been set around his birthday. So it was an opportunity for him to fly into Chicago, accept birthday wishes, and oh, by the way, as his present, take the nomination. He was even planning the logistics, what time Mrs. Johnson would come in and how they would get to the convention hall.
Tentatively, we hope to come in and we want to know where to go. And we go to the closest place where we have the safest place, to the amphitheater. I guess we go to the Hilton. Does that have a helicopter roof landing?
It just couldn't be done. The town would have exploded even more than it did with Humphrey.
We heard a ruckus down, below us. We were on the front window. We went over there and we saw the cops coming up Balboa and then take that turn into Grant Park and go in there and wail the daylights out of those demonstrators and rioters or whatever you want, protesters, for about 10 or 15 minutes. And that was the event, I think, that destroyed the Democratic Party that year. As Hunter Thompson said, Richard Nixon is President of the United States today because of what had happened in Grant Park that night.
This was so unprecedented. I mean, you had Abe Ribicoff, the senator from Connecticut, screaming at Mayor Daley and pointing to him on national television.
And with George McGovern as President of the United States, we wouldn't have to have Gestapo tactics in the streets of Chicago. How hard it is to accept the truth.
Mayor Daley really did have goons in that convention hall. And any delegate who got out of line or started indicating that he or she was going to dissent, generally speaking, was either shown the door or was beaten up.
Take your hands off of me. Unless you intend to arrest me, don't push me, please.
Sir, I'm trying to...
I know you will, but don't push me. Take your hands off of me unless you intend to arrest me.
Wait a minute.
Wait a minute. Well, Walter, as you can see... I'm sorry to be out of breath, but somebody belted me in the stomach doing that. What happened is a Georgia delegate, at least he had a Georgia delegate sign on, was being hauled out of the hall. We tried to talk to him to see why, who he was, and what the situation was. And at that instant, the security people, well, as you can see, put me on the deck. I didn't do very well. I think we've got a bunch of thugs here, Dan.
As a family, we had a box right next to the podium, and down in the bottom of that box was a television.
Mr. Chairman.
Here we were looking up, listening to my father give his acceptance speech, an eloquent acceptance speech.
I proudly accept the nomination of our party.
And right down at our feet was a riot going on. I mean, it was like night and day. It was two worlds.
We do not want a police state, but we need a state of law and order. And neither mob violence nor police brutality have any place in America.
You can't have that not impact you. You know that what is being said is what you hope people will hear, but what they're hearing and what they're seeing is what's going on outside. I think only a person with my father's deep wealth of optimism could say, okay, we're still going to do this, and we are going to win. The day he walked out of that convention, he was 20 points down. He was a dead political duck in the water.
The three vice presidential nominees couldn't have been more different. The one who was clearly most highly regarded from the start was Edmund Muskie, senator from Maine. He had a pleasant, reassuring manner on television, and that's exactly what people needed, and certainly Democrats needed, kind of a human Pepto-Bismol. And Humphrey realized it immediately. Muskie was actually the most popular of all of the national candidates that year in public opinion polling. The Republican Party had an embarrassment of riches for the vice presidency, and there were more than 20 pretty stellar individuals on the list that Nixon considered, from Nelson Rockefeller to Ronald Reagan. The various factions in the Republican Party eliminated this one and that one as unacceptable, and what remained were complete unknowns, including a new governor of Maryland by the name of Spiro T. Agnew. Agnew was not very adept politically because of a lack of experience, and it wasn't very long before people got to know Ted Agnew. He was a big negative for the Nixon campaign.
A running mate who has a strange habit of calling people Japs and Polacks. A vice presidential nominee who has casually remarked, and I quote, "If you've seen one slum, you've seen them all."
General Curtis LeMay also turned out to be a big negative for George Wallace.
My father prepared to introduce General LeMay in Philadelphia to the national press. For 2 weeks leading up to that, he told General LeMay that I'm about to introduce you to the national, as my father put it, media wolves. And he said, they will try to maneuver you into a conversation about the use of nuclear weapons in Vietnam. The nuances of politics and the back and forth with the press was new to him. So he snapped.
Doesn't make much difference to me if I have to go to war and get killed in the jungle of Vietnam with a rusty knife or get killed with a nuclear weapon. As a matter of fact, if I had the choice, I'd lean towards a nuclear weapon.
I never remember the national press extolling his virtues in helping win World War II. They simply set out to try to catch him, get him, if you will, and they did that.
In 1968, with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act having been long passed and the open housing law passed after Martin Luther King's assassination, Wallace was able to capitalize on the unrest in the central cities all across America.
Why are more and more millions of Americans turning to Governor Wallace? Follow as your children are bused across town.
As president, I shall, within the law, turn back the absolute control of the public school systems to the people of the respective states.
Why are more and more millions of Americans turning to Governor Wallace? Take a walk in your street or park tonight.
As president, I shall help make it possible for you and your families to walk the streets of our cities in safety.
I got to listen to my father's fiery speeches, which were just wonderful. We traveled from Rhode Island to Florida. They hated George Wallace up north, so you would have a section of Wallace lovers and a section of Wallace haters, and he could bait the haters like nobody could.
Well, you come down when I get through and I'll autograph your sandals for you.
Yes, down at the Selma Bridge. Come on back down, Dad, and we'll let you jump off of it next time you get down there. How about that?
And you know the biggest bigots in the world? They are the folks that call other folks bigots. You remember that?
I said in California that if I come to that state, or go to New York, or come to Seattle, and a group of anarchists lie down in front of my automobile as president, I'm going to wean them of lying in front of automobiles.
My father would go into a local area. He'd speak to a couple of civic clubs. He would do every talk radio program there was to do back in that day. He wouldn't just focus on national media, so people heard about him all the time. They listened to his message, and it resonated with a lot of people.
It doesn't matter. Look, you the same like you for Wallace. You will for Wallace. It's for the USA.
1968, the Madison Square Garden rally. It was packed, and they had thousands of people on the outside listening on loudspeakers. And it was middle-class people, working people who he talked to. He talked about the beautician and the barber and the steel worker and the textile worker. He refined it down to the point where the average person thought, he's talking about me. He's articulating my frustrations and my concerns about our country. And at one point in that campaign, he was at 24% in the polls.
Nixon's problem was mainly Wallace, but secondarily it was himself.
Your daughter here? I hope you got her in it.
He never really won the trust of the American public.
Well, great. Aren't you having fun?
The polls showed him well ahead, and that makes you cautious. You don't say much, you don't do much, you don't rock the boat. You just try and ride it out to Election Day.
How do you expect to gain the respect of the American people in the event you're elected?
Well, I think by my record of public service, when a man says that he thinks that the most important thing is to double the rate of convictions, but he doesn't believe, and then he condemns the Vice President, myself, for wanting to double the war on poverty, I think that man has lost his sense of values. You're not going to make this a better America just because you build more jails. What this country needs are more decent neighborhoods, more educated people, better homes. I do not believe that repression alone builds a better society. Now, if Mr. Nixon can close his eyes to that, then he doesn't have enough vision to be president of this country. And that's why I've said what I've said.
Wallace took some of the southern states that Nixon would have won because of his southern strategy.
Nixon and his party decided that they would be conservative on race issues. They would do what Lyndon Johnson had predicted. He predicted that the Democratic Party would lose the South because of the Civil Rights Acts, the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act of '64, and that the Southern strategy would turn the South, and it did.
It is time for an honest look at the problem of order in the United States. Dissent is a necessary ingredient of change. But in a system of government that provides for peaceful change, there is no cause that justifies resort to violence. Let us recognize that the first civil right of every American is to be free from domestic violence. So I pledge to you, we shall have order in the United States.
Their big hang-up was Lyndon Johnson and the war. Was Humphrey able to resist Lyndon Johnson?
It came to a point in time where his own staff and he recognized that if he was to have any chance at all of being the next president of the United States, he had to speak forthrightly out about how he felt about the war.
My fellow Americans, I have pledged that my first priority as president shall be to end the war and obtain an honorable peace. As president, I would stop the bombing of the North as an acceptable risk for peace, because I believe it could lead to success in the negotiations and thereby shorten the war.
Once he made that speech in Salt Lake City, it was like taking a yoke off of him.
And all those people who had been cursing him for his role in Vietnam and for being basically a poodle of Lyndon Johnson and the chief cheerleader of Johnson's war, basically said in effect, if you mean it, we're with you. But you could feel Humphrey gaining momentum and us basically being static all through October. We didn't rise an inch.
But I'll tell you, it isn't going to be like 48. Lots of things have changed. You remember that was the year that Harry Truman won by giving them hell. Well, it won't work this time, because just remember, I'm sure you will all agree with this, that it's one thing to give him hell, but it's something else to give him Humphrey, believe me.
We have found that our friend, the Republican nominee, our California friend, has been playing on the outskirts with our enemies and our friends both. He's been doing it through rather subterranean sources here. And he has been saying to the Allies that you're going to get sold out. Mrs. Chenault is contacting their ambassador. Now, this is not guesswork. And she is warning them to not get pulled in on this Johnson move.
We now know that Richard Nixon had asked Anna Chennault, who was the chairman of the Republican Women for Nixon, to be a back channel to the South Vietnamese, to encourage them not to participate in peace talks in Paris under the Lyndon Johnson administration, because they would get a better deal with the Richard Nixon administration. If, in fact, Richard Nixon played a hand in curtailing the peace talks in Paris, there's no doubt that that's a violation of the Logan Act. And the Logan Act essentially prevents American citizens from getting in the way of American foreign policy. It is essentially treason.
Now, Nixon, even though he was a former vice president, was a private citizen at that time. So he would have been covered by the Logan Act. LBJ was furious.
They're contacting a foreign power in the middle of a war. That's a mistake. And it's a damn bad mistake.
When he heard what Nixon's people at least were doing and what Mrs. Chennault was doing, he was deeply angry. He wanted to expose Nixon, but realized that if he did so, it would be obvious that he knew because of illegal wiretaps.
You just see it, your people don't tell the South Vietnamese that they're going to get any better deal out of the United States government than a conference.
Yeah, and also we've got to make sure that Hanoi knows they're not going to get it.
Yeah, that's exactly right, and I'm doing that.
But he gives that information to Hubert Humphrey, and Johnson says, do what you want with it, Hubert.
Hubert, glad to hear you, my friend. I'm Nixon's folks. I don't know whether he had anything to do with it or not. Don't charge that he did. I can't prove it. But some of the people supporting him have told South Vietnamese that they don't let Johnson sell them out here at the conference table and bring them in the NLF. Humphrey's going to get beat, and they'll have a bright future.
And Humphrey decides not to do anything with it. He thinks the country has been torn apart enough.
After all this time, I'm really not sure whether there was a direct violation of the Logan Act and whether you could actually call, as even Everett Dirksen, the Republican leader in the Senate, did, Nixon a traitor. You know, if you're inclined that way, you will call Nixon a traitor. If you're a Republican who wanted to win in an age of dirty tricks on all sides, you'd say it was good politics. Take your pick.
So I finally took the bull by the horns, got all the Joint Chiefs of Staff in, and they all agreed that A, we should stop the bombing, and I'm going to issue an order later tonight to stop it tomorrow. There's going to be a lot of people say we did this for you. So for God's sakes, we know, everybody knows, we don't play politics with human lives.
I have now ordered that all air, naval, and artillery bombardment of North Vietnam cease.
The bombing halt which occurred had a substantial effect in that it brought many Democratic votes to Humphrey, and the timing could not have been coincidental. At some point, the anti-war faction, or those Democrats or those voters who were against the war, figured that if they were against Humphrey, they were going to get Nixon. And Nixon was no improvement on the Johnson policies. He had supported Johnson during the war. He had questioned his management of it, but he had supported him. And as a consequence, they decided, ultimately, you better vote for Humphrey.
2 days from now, the American people will exercise that great sovereign power of the right of the ballot, and they'll be entering the voting booth where they will make the great decision as to whom shall lead them.
Hubert Humphrey began to believe that he would win. He saw his private poll numbers rising pretty dramatically. He knew he didn't need a majority or anything close to it because of Wallace. And Nixon was uneasy enough so that he had a family conference right before the election, just with his immediate family. Nixon said, look, we've done everything we can. I hope we're going to win, but we may lose, and I want you prepared for it. It's a very close election.
The real danger for us was that Wallace would get enough electoral votes to deny us the 269-270 you needed to win, and the election would be thrown into the House of Representatives. And all those Wallace states would then, because they had 100% Democratic delegations, wouldn't vote for Nixon for president in the House of Representatives. They would vote for Hubert Humphrey even if he hadn't won the popular vote.
Remember, 270 are needed. The struggle has rivaled the 1960 razor-edge finish when Nixon lost to John F. Kennedy.
From about 2 a.m. till about 6 a.m., we thought we'd lost. At least that's what I was picking up, that Humphrey was doing too well in several states and that the numbers just weren't going to add up.
It is indeed a toss-up. We've got those big states that are outstanding, New Jersey, Texas, Ohio, Illinois, and California. They are going to make the difference.
Mayor Daley was holding out his votes in Chicago, according to tradition, but our guys were apparently holding out votes in DuPage County. Daley would throw in some votes, and they would be overwhelmingly Humphrey, and we'd throw in votes from the suburban areas, and they were overwhelmingly Nixon. And I think Mitchell called Mike Wallace, who talked to Cronkite, and in effect they went on television and said Mayor Daley has got to turn in his vote.
Illinois, with its 26 electoral votes, finally swung into the Republican column. And with it, Hubert Humphrey's bid for the high office on Pennsylvania Avenue.
We had the election.
And then he did the right thing. He said it's over. The people have spoken, and the process goes on. That's tough for a candidate that comes that close. Just say, okay, now I'm going to support the next president, even though I don't agree with all his policies, but he's the next president.
Having lost a close one 8 years ago and having won a close one this year, I can say this: winning's a lot more fun.
In our judgment, our movement has been successful. And I think that most of you probably thought a year ago that we not only wouldn't get on the 50 ballots in the country, but had someone asked you, would this ticket get 10 million votes for the presidency a year ago, I think most of you would answer in the negative.
Even with the 10 million votes he received, almost 14%, one more vote per precinct, and he would have thrown it to the House. But, and of course, it would have gone into the House without the miscue of General LeMay. I'm convinced of that.
We, as a people, as a movement, misread the significance of a Humphrey victory. If Humphrey had won, we would have sustained all of the social justice programs and no doubt ended the war as well. He had a voice and a conscience and a track record. Humphrey's problem was he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. He could not get freed from the stain of war.
There are a lot of warnings that come from 1968. Doing everything we can to make sure that we are a country ruled by the ballot and not the bullet. I think we also learned something that we seem to relearn with great regularity, that the issue in American politics often is race, and it's the most divisive subject of all.
I think the abhorrence of war and what the war in Vietnam dealt us has continued. From time to time, people say, since then, have we gotten over it, the abhorrence of war? The Vietnam syndrome, is it dead? No, it isn't. The country, as it has done before, survives and can go on to prosper, no matter how jarring events seem to be. The basic fundamental structure of government is laid out in such a way that most people think there's a way for them to have some sort of voice. It may not be true, but they think it. And that's very important.
We were shouting at each other all through that 1968 campaign, everybody, both sides. And I think we learned that that wasn't a good way to conduct an election or to run a country.
Come on, shoot the kill! Kill! Shoot the kill! Come on!
We just ended up pessimistic, negative, angry, conspiratorial, kind of a dark range of emotions for which we paid a great price. It took us a long time to get out of that hole.
We have ignition sequence start. The engines are on. The clock is running.
Most people were eager for 1968 to end. There were just too many bad memories. We were helped in a most unexpected way on Christmas Eve by Apollo 8. Almost everyone was gathered with their families, and they were beginning to open presents, or they're having a Christmas Eve meal.
In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth.
It was so moving to see this and to hear the astronauts and to realize that for all of our problems, we also had achieved a great deal in the 1960s. It gave us a little peace on Christmas Eve to hear a bit of Genesis read from men circling the moon, which to us was unattainable. And yet, there we were.